The mountains of Appalachia keep their secrets. They swallow stories whole, tales of cruelty and kindness alike, vanishing into mist-shrouded valleys and forgotten hollows. But some stories refuse to stay buried. Some tales claw their way through time and hardship to remind us what survival truly costs and what mercy can build from the ashes of injustice. This is one such story. The story of Sarah Mitchell, once beloved teacher of Pinewood, then condemned as a witch. The story of how prejudice and fear can poison even the kindest hearts. And the story of Thomas Blackfeather, a man who had every reason to turn away, yet chose to stand between a stranger and certain death. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Ice crystals formed on Sarah Mitchell's eyelashes as she stumbled through knee-deep snow, each labored breath visible in the fading December light. Her fingers, long since numb, clutched the ragged woolen shawl around her shoulders, a pitiful defense against the mountain winter. 5 months pregnant and 3 days without proper food, her once sturdy frame had begun to falter, her steps becoming less certain with each passing hour. A bitter wind howled down from the ridgeline, carrying the promise of more snow before. Nightfall. Sarah pressed her back against a gnarled oak, shielding herself from the worst of the gale. She closed her eyes, gathering what little strength remained. The child within her stirred, a flutter of movement that brought both comfort and despair. How could she protect this life when she could barely sustain her own? "Just a little farther," she whispered, though she had no destination. No shelter awaited her in these woods. No friendly faces would greet her arrival. The people of Pinewood had made certain of that when they drove her out with torches and accusations, led by Mayor Caldwell himself, the same man who had once praised her teaching as a blessing upon our humble community. Funny how quickly blessings became curses when fear took root. The sickness had come first to the Miller twins, 2 bright-eyed boys who rarely missed a day of lessons at the riverbend. School. Sarah had noticed their absence immediately, sent a note home. By week's end, 4 more children had fallen ill. Then 8, then 15. A fever that burned through the settlement like wildfire, leaving 3 small graves in the churchyard before it began to subside. Sarah had worked tirelessly, moving from home to home with remedies her grandmother had taught her. Willow bark tea for the fever, honey and wild cherry for the coughs. She'd barely slept, barely eaten, determined that no more children would be lost on her watch. But whispers had already begun, sparked by William Harmon, whose niece had been among the first to perish. "Ain't natural," he'd declared on the church steps that Sunday. That Mitchell woman was seen gathering strange herbs by moonlight, talking to herself out by the creek. And now our children suffer. The whispers grew louder after Sarah's friend Martha Cooper revealed that Sarah kept a book of peculiar recipes passed down from her grandmother. Martha, who had once shared tea at Sarah's table every Sunday after service, now clutched her own children close whenever Sarah passed. "She mixed something in the school water bucket," Martha had testified before the town council. "I saw her adding powder from a strange pouch. The very next day, my Johnny complained of a headache." It hadn't mattered that Sarah had been adding dried mint to freshen the drinking water, as she had done all year. It hadn't mattered that she herself had nursed many of the children day and night. And it certainly hadn't mattered that she carried an unborn child, her late husband, Jacob's final gift before pneumonia had claimed him last spring. The verdict had been swift. Banishment. In the middle of winter, with nothing but the clothes on her back and whatever she could carry. Mayor Caldwell had at least allowed her that much, despite Bill Harmon's insistence that a witch deserved the rope. "Leave Clearwater Valley by nightfall," the mayor had pronounced, unable to meet her eyes. "And never return." Now 3 days into her exile, Sarah faced the growing certainty that she would not survive another night in the open. The last of her bread had gone stale yesterday. The jerky was finished this morning. The water in her canteen had frozen solid hours ago. A sound startled her, branches breaking under weight not far away. Her head snapped up, eyes scanning the gathering darkness. A deer, perhaps, or a wolf. Neither would make much difference. Now, she pushed away from the tree, forcing herself forward, one foot then the other. She would not die huddled against an oak. She would walk until her legs gave out, fight until her heart stopped beating. For the child, always for the child. The ground sloped downward, becoming treacherous with hidden rocks beneath the snow. Sarah moved carefully, one hand braced against tree trunks for balance. The fading light made each step a gamble. In the distance, a raven called, the sound echoing strangely through the silent forest. When her foot slipped on an icy patch, Sarah couldn't catch herself in time. She fell hard, tumbling down the incline, snow and broken branches scraping at her face and hands. Pain lanced through her ankle as it twisted beneath her weight. She came to rest at the bottom of the small ravine, breathless and disoriented. For long moments, she simply lay there, tears freezing on her cheeks. The darkening sky spun overhead, stars beginning to emerge like distant, indifferent witnesses. When she finally tried to stand, her ankle buckled beneath her, sending her crashing back to the snow. "No," she whispered fiercely. "Get up!" She tried again, using a fallen log for support. This time she managed to rise, though she couldn't put weight on the injured ankle. The pain made her dizzy, black spots dancing at the edges of her vision. Night was falling rapidly now, the temperature dropping with each passing minute. Sarah took one halting step, then another, dragging the useless limb behind her. Each movement sent fresh waves of agony up her leg. The child within her stirred. Again, more urgently now, as if sensing her desperation. "I'm sorry," she murmured, one hand pressed to her swollen belly. "I'm trying." Another 10 steps, another 15. The forest grew darker, the shadows longer. When she looked up again, she could barely make out the path ahead. Something warm and wet had begun to trickle down her leg, not snow melting through her skirts, but blood. Raw fear clawed at her throat. Not the baby. Please, not the baby. A cramp seized her abdomen, forcing her to double over. Too early, much too early. She wasn't due until late spring. Sarah clutched a tree trunk, breathing hard through clenched teeth. "Help!" she called weakly, though she knew no one could hear. "Somebody help me!" Only the wind answered, cutting through her clothes like knives. Sarah slid down against the tree, no longer able to stand. She pulled her knees toward her chest, trying to conserve what little warmth remained in her body. The bleeding seemed to have slowed, but the cramps continued, each one stealing her breath. As darkness claimed the forest completely, Sarah's thoughts turned to Jacob. He would be so disappointed in her failure. He had been so excited about the baby, had already begun carving a cradle from oak before the sickness took him. Now that cradle sat half-finished in a home she would never see again. A twig snapped nearby, louder this time, deliberate. Sarah's head jerked up, eyes straining to pierce the gloom. A shadow moved between the trees, too large for a deer, too smooth. In its motions for a bear. A man. He emerged from the tree line slowly, a rifle held loosely in one hand. Tall and broad-shouldered, he wore buckskin leggings and a heavy wool coat, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his forehead. In the dim starlight, she could make out high cheekbones and dark eyes that watched her with cautious interest. Sarah scrambled backward instinctively, ignoring the pain that shot through her ankle. She had nothing to defend herself with, not even a stick. "Stay back," she warned, voice cracking from thirst and fear. The man paused, keeping his distance. "You're bleeding," he said simply. His voice was deep, accented with a cadence she didn't recognize. "I'm fine." The lie was absurd, even to her own ears. He made a skeptical sound, then slowly set his rifle down against a tree, far enough away that she couldn't reach it, but a gesture of peace nonetheless. "You have a hurt leg, and you carry a child." It wasn't a question. Sarah said nothing, watching him warily. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He was clearly Cherokee, or part Cherokee at least. His dark hair hung in a single braid down his back, and a medicine pouch was visible at his belt. The settlers in Pinewood told stories about the remaining Cherokee in these mountains. Some claimed they were peaceful. Others insisted they were vengeful ghosts, haunting the land that had once been theirs. "The storm comes," he continued, gesturing toward the north, where clouds had begun to gather. "You will die here tonight." His bluntness startled her. "Then let me die in peace," she replied, summoning what dignity she could. Something like respect flickered across his features. He studied her for a long moment, then sighed deeply, his breath fogging in the cold air. "I am Thomas," he said. Sarah hesitated. Names held power. Her grandmother had always taught her. To give your name was to offer a piece of yourself. But she had little left to lose. "Sarah," she finally answered. "Sarah Mitchell." Thomas nodded, once acknowledging the exchange. "You are from Pinewood." It wasn't a question, but Sarah felt compelled to explain. "Not anymore. They cast you out." Again, not a question. "In your condition, they think I'm a witch," she said, bitterness creeping into her voice. "They blame me for the fever that took their children." Thomas's expression didn't change, but something hardened in his eyes. "White people fear what they don't understand," he said. "Medicine, weather, birth, death." He gestured toward her swollen belly. "Women's power." Another cramp seized her then, more intense than before. Sarah couldn't suppress a groan of pain, doubling over as her vision blurred. When the spasm passed, she found Thomas crouching nearby, close enough to touch her but maintaining a respectful distance. "You need shelter," he said. "Warmth, medicine for the bleeding." "Why would you help me?" Sarah managed, suspicious. Despite her desperate situation, Thomas was silent for a moment. "I have my reasons," he finally said. "Will you come, or shall I leave you to your choice?" Sarah weighed her options quickly. Stay and certainly die, or trust this stranger and possibly live. For the baby's sake, there was only one choice. "I'll come," she whispered. Thomas nodded once, then moved with surprising gentleness to help her stand. When it became clear she couldn't walk, even with support, he hesitated only briefly before lifting her into his arms. Sarah stiffened at the contact but didn't protest. She was beyond pride now. "My cabin is not far," he said, retrieving his rifle with his free hand. "Hold tight." As he carried her through the darkening forest, Sarah fought to stay conscious. The warmth of another human body after days alone was almost overwhelming. Despite her fear and pain, her eyelids grew heavy, her head eventually coming to rest against Thomas's shoulder. "Stay awake," he said sharply. "Talk to me." "About what?" she murmured. "Anything. Why you became a teacher." The question seemed to come from far away, but Sarah forced herself to focus on it. "I love children," she said simply. "The way they see the world. Everything new, everything possible." Thomas grunted acknowledgement, adjusting his grip. As he navigated a steep section of trail, "You have none of your own? Besides..." He nodded toward her belly. "No." The word came out heavier than she intended. "My husband and I, we tried for years. This one..." She placed a protective hand over her stomach. "This one is a miracle. Jacob never even knew. He died before I realized." Thomas said nothing. To this, but his arms tightened slightly around her, whether in sympathy or simply to secure his hold, she couldn't tell. They moved through the forest for what seemed like hours, but was likely only minutes. The trees began to thin, giving way to a small clearing. In the center stood a cabin, sturdy and well-built, with smoke curling from a stone chimney. A small corral to one side housed 2 horses who nickered softly at their approach. "We're here," Thomas said, his voice bringing Sarah back from the edge of unconsciousness. The cabin door opened with a nudge from his boot, revealing a simple but comfortable interior, bathed in the golden glow of firelight. A large hearth dominated one wall, a cooking pot suspended above glowing coals, furs and woven blankets covered, a wooden frame bed in one corner. Herbs hung drying from the rafters, filling the space with earthy scents. Thomas carried her to the bed and set her down carefully. "Rest," he instructed, moving immediately to stoke the fire. "I'll make medicine for the bleeding." Sarah sank into the unexpected softness of the furs, warmth beginning to seep back into her frozen limbs. She watched through half-closed eyes as Thomas moved efficiently around the cabin, gathering dried plants from various bundles hanging from the ceiling. "Are you a healer?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He glanced at her. "My grandmother was a medicine woman. She taught me." The parallel to her own grandmother wasn't lost on Sarah. She watched as he crushed herbs in a wooden mortar, adding water from a kettle near the fire. "Why are you helping me?" she asked again. "Your people have no reason to help mine." Thomas continued working without looking up. "You are not your people. I am not mine." He added another herb to the mixture. "And no woman carrying a child deserves to die alone in the snow." He brought the mixture to her in a clay cup. "Drink," he instructed, "all of it." Sarah hesitated only briefly before taking the cup. The liquid was bitter but not unpleasant, with hints of mint and something earthier beneath. She drank obediently, desperate enough to trust that he meant no harm. "Your ankle needs wrapping," Thomas said, already gathering supplies. "And you need dry clothes." He moved to a wooden chest, returning with a simple dress of buckskin, clearly made for a woman, though well worn and faded. Sarah looked at it questioningly. "My sister's," he explained briefly. "She does not need it anymore." There was a story there, but Sarah was too exhausted to ask. She simply nodded her thanks. "I will step outside," Thomas said, moving toward the door. "Change if you can. If not, I will help when I return." When the door closed behind him, Sarah managed to struggle out of her frozen, bloodied clothes and into the buckskin dress. It fit well enough over her swollen belly, the soft leather a shocking luxury against her skin after days in wet wool. By the time Thomas returned, she had settled back against the furs, another cramp building in her abdomen. He assessed her with a quick glance, then set to work on her injured ankle. His hands were calloused but gentle as he examined the swollen joint. "Not broken," he pronounced, "but bad sprain." He wrapped it efficiently with strips of clean cloth, his movements practiced and sure. When he finished, he sat back on his mat, heels studying her face. "The bleeding, has it stopped?" Sarah nodded. "I think so. The cramps are still coming, though." Concern flickered across his features. "Too early for the baby." "Yes," she whispered. "Much too early." Thomas rose and moved to the fire, adding more wood until flames leapt high in the hearth. "Rest now," he said. "Medicine will help. Tomorrow we will see." Sarah wanted to ask more questions about him, about his sister, about what would happen when she was well enough to leave, but exhaustion claimed her before she could form the words. The last thing she saw before sleep took her was Thomas settling into a chair near the fire, his knife in one hand and a piece of wood in the other, his eyes occasionally lifting to check on her. For the first time in days, Sarah slept without fear of never waking. The night passed in fragments for Sarah, moments of consciousness interspersed with deep, healing sleep. Sometimes she woke to find Thomas replacing cool cloths on her forehead. Other times, she glimpsed him adding wood to the fire or preparing more of the bitter medicine that seemed to ease the cramping. By morning, the bleeding had stopped completely, and the child within her moved with reassuring vigor. Outside, snow fell in thick, silent sheets, burying the world in white. Thomas had risen before dawn, his side of the cabin already neat, a pot of something fragrant simmering over the fire. "Good morning," he said when he noticed her watching him. The storm came, as I said. Sarah struggled to sit up, wincing as her muscles protested. "We would have died out there." Thomas nodded once, acknowledgement without expectation of gratitude. He ladled something from the pot into a wooden bowl and brought it to her. "Eat," he instructed. "Venison stew, good for blood loss." The stew was rich and flavorful, filled with tender meat and wild onions. Sarah hadn't realized how hungry she was until the first spoonful passed her lips. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, conscious of Thomas watching her from his place by the fire. "Thank you," she said when she'd finished, "for everything." He accepted the empty bowl with a slight nod. "How is the child today?" "Active," Sarah replied, placing a hand on her belly. "Strong." "Good." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Strong like the mother." The words caught her off guard. No one had called her strong before, certainly not in Pinewood, where she had always been the gentle schoolteacher or poor, widowed Mrs. Mitchell. Before she could respond, Thomas had moved to the door, pulling on a heavy coat. "I must check traps," he explained. "You will be safe here. Rest. Do not try to walk yet." After he left, Sarah took stock of her surroundings. More carefully than she had been able to the night before, the cabin was small but meticulously organized. One wall held an impressive array of tools, knives of various sizes, fishing hooks, a bow and quiver of arrows. Another displayed several cured animal hides stretched on wooden frames. What caught her attention most, however, was a small shelf near the bed. It held a few precious books, their spines cracked and worn from frequent reading, alongside carved wooden figures of animals. A woman's necklace hung from a peg, its polished stone pendant catching the firelight. Something personal, something preserved. Sarah looked away, feeling as though she'd intruded on private grief. She turned her attention to the books, curious about what a man living alone in the wilderness might read. Carefully, she reached for the nearest volume, wincing as the movement pulled at sore muscles. The book was heavier than she expected, bound in faded leather with gold lettering nearly worn away. "Paradise Lost," she read aloud, surprised. Milton seemed an unlikely companion for a Cherokee hunter. Next to it sat a tattered copy of Shakespeare's sonnets, a guide to medicinal plants, and most surprising of all, a primer much like the one she used to teach her youngest students. Sarah ran her fingers over the embossed cover, a wave of homesickness washing over her for the classroom she would never see again. When Thomas returned hours later, his coat dusted with snow and a pair of rabbits in hand, he found Sarah seated at the small table, her injured leg propped on a stool. She had managed to comb her long brown hair with her fingers and wash her face with water from a basin near the bed. "You should be resting," he said, hanging the rabbits on a hook by the door. "I've rested enough," she replied. "I want to be useful." She gestured to the pile of herbs she'd been sorting. "I recognize these. My grandmother used them for fever. I thought I could help prepare them." Thomas studied her for a moment, then nodded. "You know plants?" "Some," she admitted, "enough to be called a witch in Pinewood." A sound escaped him that might have been a laugh. "Then we are both witches." He removed his coat and moved to inspect her work. "You separate them well." They worked in companionable silence for a while, Thomas skinning the rabbits while Sarah continued with the herbs. Outside, the snow fell relentlessly, already piling high against the cabin walls. "How long have you lived here?" Sarah asked. "Eventually." Thomas glanced up from his work. 5 winters. Alone. He nodded, returning his attention to the rabbit. "And before that?" His hands stilled momentarily. "Before that, I lived with my people, near what you call Butler Creek." Sarah knew of the place, a small Cherokee settlement that had somehow survived the removals decades earlier. "What made you leave?" Thomas was quiet for so long that Sarah thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, touched with an old pain. "My wife died, bringing our son into the world." The boy followed shortly after. His knife moved again, steady and precise. "I could not stay where every face reminded me of what was lost." The simple tragedy of it struck Sarah speechless. How many stories like this existed in these mountains? How many broken hearts hiding in remote cabins and isolated homesteads? "I'm sorry," she said finally. "As am I for your husband," he replied. The exchange of griefs hung between them, a strange kind of understanding. Later, as they ate roasted rabbit by firelight, Sarah found herself watching Thomas's hands, strong, capable hands that had carried her through the forest, wrapped her ankle, prepared medicine and food. Hands that had once held a wife, had tried to save a son. "Will your people come looking for you?" Thomas asked suddenly. Sarah shook her head. "They meant for me to die. They won't waste energy searching." "And when the snow melts, where will you go?" The question hit her like a physical blow. She had been so focused on immediate survival that she hadn't thought beyond the next day, the next meal, the next moment of safety. "I don't know," she admitted. "West, perhaps. I've heard there are settlements in Tennessee that need teachers." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. It would be a difficult journey, especially with a child. "I have no choice," Sarah said, one hand moving protectively to her belly. "I can't stay in these mountains, not with Pinewood so close." "You could," Thomas said quietly. When she looked at him in surprise, he added, "Not all who live in these mountains fear witches." Before Sarah could respond, a sudden gust of wind rattled the cabin windows, drawing their attention. The storm was worsening, snow now driving horizontally past the glass. "It will be a bad night," Thomas observed, rising to add wood to the fire. "The wind has teeth." As if to emphasize his point, a particularly violent gust shook the entire structure, sending a shower of snow down the chimney with a hiss. Sarah pulled her borrowed blanket closer around her shoulders, suddenly grateful for the solid walls between her and the killing cold. "Will it hold?" she asked. Thomas looked almost offended. "I built this cabin with my own hands. It has weathered worse." Sarah smiled at his pride. "Then I'm in good hands." Something shifted in his expression at her words, a softening around the eyes, quickly masked as he turned back to the fire. But Sarah had seen it, that momentary vulnerability. It made him human in a way that his efficiency and capability somehow hadn't. "Rest," he said, his back still to her. "Tomorrow, your strength must return. I will teach you to walk with a crutch." That night, as howling wind battered the cabin and firelight danced across log walls, Sarah dreamed of her classroom in Pinewood. The children's faces were bright and attentive as she read to them from a book of poems. But when she looked up from the page, the classroom had transformed into Thomas's cabin, and the children wore buckskin instead of calico and homespun. In the corner, a cradle rocked gently, though she couldn't see what it held. She woke, feeling strangely peaceful, the dream lingering like a promise rather than fading like smoke. Outside, the storm still raged, But within these walls, something new had begun to take root, fragile as a spring seedling, but alive nonetheless. The storm lasted 3 days, imprisoning them in the small cabin. On the second day, true to his word, Thomas fashioned a crutch for Sarah from a forked branch, padding the armrest with rabbit fur. She practiced moving around the confined space, awkward at first, but growing more confident under his watchful eye. By the third day, she could navigate the cabin's interior without assistance, though she tired quickly, her body still recovering. From exposure and blood loss, they fell into an oddly domestic rhythm, Thomas hunting and tending to outside chores during brief lulls in the weather, Sarah preparing herbs, mending torn clothing she found in a basket, and eventually taking over some of the cooking. They spoke little, but the silence between them grew comfortable rather than strained. On the fourth morning, Sarah woke to golden light streaming through frost-covered windows. The storm had broken during the night, leaving behind a transformed world of pristine white. Thomas was already gone, his side of the cabin neat, the fire built up and a pot of tea steeping near the hearth. Sarah eased herself out of bed, testing her ankle. The swelling had subsided considerably, though the joint remained tender. Using her crutch, she made her way to the window and gazed out at the snow-covered clearing. The brightness nearly hurt her eyes after days of storm gloom. In the fresh snow, she could see Thomas's tracks leading toward the tree line. As she watched, movement caught her eye. Thomas emerging from the forest, dragging a small sled loaded with firewood. The morning sun caught in his dark hair as he bent to adjust the load, his breath clouding around his face. There was something arresting about the scene, the solitary figure against the vast whiteness, the simple, necessary task. It struck Sarah that this was a life stripped to essentials: warmth, food, shelter. No pretense, no social games, no weight of others' expectations. Just survival, day by day. Thomas glanced up then, catching sight of her at the window. He paused, then raised a hand in greeting. Sarah returned the gesture, suddenly self-conscious, though she couldn't have said why. Later, as she helped him stack the wood beside the hearth, she broke their companionable silence. "I saw your books," she said. "Milton, Shakespeare." Thomas glanced at her, expression unreadable. "Does that surprise you?" "A little," she admitted. "Where did you get them?" "A trader, 3 summers ago. Cost me 4 deerskins and a bear pelt." A faint smile touched his lips. "Worth every one?" "You enjoy reading?" "Words are." He paused, searching for the right expression. "Good company on winter nights." Sarah smiled at that. "I used to read to my students every day. Even the older boys would sit quiet as mice for a good story." "What did you read to them?" "Bible stories, folk tales, poetry when I could slip it in without the school board noticing." She placed another log on the stack. "Most of them had never heard of Shakespeare or Milton, nor had I before the books." Thomas straightened, brushing wood chips from his hands. "My people have different stories. Stories of how the world began, how animals came to be as they are." "Would you tell me one?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious. Thomas looked surprised by the request, then thoughtful. "Perhaps tonight, by the fire." It was a small thing, this. Promise of a story, but it felt significant somehow, an offering, a bridge between their separate worlds. That evening, after a simple supper of cornmeal porridge sweetened with honey, Thomas kept his word. As firelight cast dancing shadows on the cabin walls, he told Sarah the Cherokee story of how the water spider brought fire to the animals. His voice, usually so spare with words, took on a rhythmic quality that suggested these were phrases handed down through generations, memorized and preserved like precious heirlooms. Sarah listened, enthralled by both the tale and the transformation in her taciturn host. When he finished, the silence felt charged with possibility. "That was beautiful," she said finally. "Thank you." Thomas nodded once, acknowledging her. "Thanks. Your turn," he said. "A story from your people." Sarah thought for a moment, then smiled. "Have you heard of King Arthur and his knights?" He shook his head, settling back in his chair, eyes intent on her face. Sarah began the tale, falling easily into the cadence she used with her students, her hands occasionally rising to illustrate a point. The sweep of Excalibur, the circular table where all knights sat as equals, the quest for the Holy Grail. Thomas listened with the same quiet intensity he brought to all tasks, interrupting only occasionally to clarify a concept foreign to his experience. By the time she finished, the fire had burned low, and the windows were frosted with ice crystals that caught the moonlight. "Your people have strange heroes," he observed, "men in metal who fight for invisible things." Sarah laughed softly. "I suppose they do." "What did you think of the story?" Thomas considered this seriously. "I liked the sword in the stone, and the idea that the land and the king are one." He paused, looking into the dying fire. "The Cherokee believe this too, that we are part of the land and it is part of us." It was the closest he had come to speaking of his people's beliefs, and Sarah recognized the gift in his words. "I think that's a wiser way to see the world than most," she replied quietly. Their eyes met across the hearth, and something passed between them. A recognition, perhaps, that despite their different paths, they had arrived at this moment with similar wounds, similar losses, similar hopes buried beneath layers of caution. Thomas broke the gaze first, rising to bank the fire for the night. "Dawn comes early," he said. "We should rest." As Sarah settled into her bed of furs, she found herself wishing for another story, another hour in the circle of firelight with this man who spoke to her as an equal, who saw her knowledge as valuable rather than dangerous. It had been so long since anyone had truly listened to her. The next morning brought clear skies and bitter cold. Sarah woke to find Thomas already dressed for hunting, checking arrows with methodical precision. "I must go further today," he explained, noting her questioning look. "Game is scarce near the cabin, too much human scent." Sarah nodded, pushing herself up on one elbow. "How long will you be gone?" "Until mid-afternoon, if the hunting is good." He hesitated, then added, "Will you be all right alone?" The question touched her. "I'll be fine. Go, we need fresh meat." Thomas nodded, satisfied. "Stay inside, keep the fire fed. If anyone comes," he frowned, clearly not liking that possibility. "If anyone comes, I'll hide," Sarah promised. "But who would be traveling in this weather?" "Men who hunt things besides deer," Thomas said grimly. The words hung ominously in the cold morning air. Sarah knew he meant bounty hunters, men who supplemented their income by tracking down escaped slaves, army deserters, and occasionally Cherokee, who had evaded removal to Oklahoma Territory years earlier. "I'll be careful," she assured him. He studied her face for a moment, then nodded. "I know you will." With that, he shouldered his bow and quiver and slipped out into the frigid morning. Alone in the cabin, Sarah found herself at loose ends. She tidied what little needed tidying, added wood to the fire, prepared a pot of herbal tea. Then, restless, she returned to Thomas's small collection of books. The primer drew her attention again. Sitting at the table, her injured leg propped on a stool, she opened the worn volume. Inside the cover, written in careful, childish script, was a name. Elizabeth Blackfeather. Sarah ran her fingers over the faded letters. Thomas's daughter? Sister? She couldn't guess his age precisely, but he seemed too young to have a child old enough to write her name so carefully. The pages were dog-eared and marked with frequent use. Occasionally, she found small drawings in the margins. Flowers, birds, a rudimentary horse. In one section about the changing seasons, a pressed leaf had been carefully preserved, its skeleton-like veins still visible through the translucent remains. The intimate glimpse into a life she knew nothing about moved Sarah deeply. Whoever Elizabeth had been, she had loved this book, had traced these letters with eager fingers, had preserved a piece of autumn between these pages. Sarah closed the primer gently and returned it to its place on the shelf. Next to it stood the copy of Paradise Lost. Opening it, she found more elegant handwriting on the flyleaf. Thomas Blackfeather, from J. Williams, in recognition of your courage and assistance. May this story of paradise and its loss speak to your spirit. The inscription raised more questions than it answered. Who was J. Williams? What courage and assistance had earned such a gift? Sarah replaced the book, feeling again like an intruder in Thomas's private history. To distract herself, she decided to attempt baking bread. Thomas kept a small sack of cornmeal and another of wheat flour, though she suspected the latter was a rare luxury. Finding a wooden bowl, she mixed cornmeal with water, salt, and a bit of honey. The familiar task soothed her, reminding her of mornings in her own cabin, preparing food for the day ahead while Jacob readied himself for work at the lumber mill. She was just forming the dough into flat cakes when a sound outside made her freeze. The distinct crunch of footsteps in snow. Too heavy to be Thomas returning early, too purposeful to be an animal. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she hastily wiped her hands on her borrowed dress. Moving as quietly as possible, she retrieved her crutch and made her way to the window. 3 men stood at the edge of the clearing, surveying the cabin with evident interest. They were bundled against the cold, rifles slung across their backs, snow crusted on their boots and hats. One gestured toward the thin column of smoke rising from the chimney, saying something Sarah couldn't hear. Another nodded and spat a stream of tobacco juice that stained the pristine snow. Sarah backed away from the window, panic rising in her throat. Thomas's warning echoed in her mind. Men who hunt things besides deer. Whether they were bounty hunters or simply travelers seeking shelter, she couldn't risk being discovered. A white woman in a Cherokee man's cabin would raise questions she had no safe answers for. Moving as quickly as her injured ankle allowed, Sarah gathered her few possessions. The woolen shawl, now dried, a small knife Thomas had given her, the crutch. She cast about desperately for a hiding place as footsteps approached the cabin. A door. The storage space beneath the bed was too obvious, the corner behind the wood stack too exposed. Her gaze fell on a small trap door in the floor near the hearth, likely a root cellar for storing vegetables through the winter. As a heavy hand pounded on the cabin door, Sarah wrenched open the trap door, wincing at the scrape of wood on wood. A ladder descended into darkness. She lowered herself awkwardly, biting her lip against the pain in her ankle, and pulled. The trapdoor closed above her, just as the cabin door swung open. In the cold, earthen-smelling darkness, Sarah pressed herself against the wall, scarcely daring to breathe. Above her, floorboards creaked under heavy boots. Men's voices, rough with cold and exertion, filled the space she had fled. "Nobody home," one said, disappointment evident. "Fire's still going," another replied. "Someone's been here recent." "Cherokee, by the looks of those carvings," the first voice observed. "Could be worth something if he's one of the ones on the list. Check for papers, anything with a name." More footsteps, the sound of objects being moved, rifled through. Sarah closed her eyes, sending up a silent prayer that they wouldn't discover the trapdoor, wouldn't find her huddled in the dark below their boots. "Nothing useful," came the disgusted report, "just books and such." "Might as well warm up while we're here," a third voice suggested. "Whoever he is, he won't mind. Sharing his fire for a spell." The men laughed, a harsh sound that raised goosebumps on Sarah's arms. She heard chairs scrape, the thump of boots being removed, the crackle of fresh wood added to the fire. "Somebody's been cooking," one observed. Smells like cornbread. Better than the jerky we've been chewing since Asheville, another replied. Keep an eye out, Harley. If our host returns, we'll have to decide if he's worth dragging back to town. Sarah's blood ran cold. These men were indeed bounty hunters, looking for Cherokee with prices on their heads. And Thomas would be walking straight into their trap when he returned from hunting. Time dragged in the darkness of the root cellar. Sarah's legs grew numb from crouching, her injured ankle throbbing in time with her racing heart. Above her, the men continued to make themselves at home, their conversation a constant reminder of the danger both she and Thomas faced. She learned their names through their casual conversation: Jenkins, Harley, and Duke. They were traveling from Asheville toward the Tennessee border, checking homesteads and hunting cabins for strays, as they called them, Cherokee who had avoided the removal or returned afterward, living quietly in the remote hollows and ridges. That last one fetched $30, Jenkins remarked at one point. Not bad for a day's work. Would have been more if you hadn't shot him in the leg, Duke replied. They pay extra for undamaged goods. The casual cruelty in their voices made Sarah's stomach turn. She thought of Thomas, his quiet dignity, his skillful hands, his books of poetry and philosophy, reduced to goods with a price on his head. As the hours wore on, the men grew restless, complaining about the cold, the hard journey ahead, the meager rewards. Eventually, after what seemed an eternity to Sarah, chairs scraped back, boots thumped on the floor. "Owner's not coming back while we're here," Harley observed. "Probably spotted us and is lying low. Let's move on," Jenkins agreed. "Still 2-3 hours of daylight left. Might reach Wilson's Creek by nightfall if we push." "Shame to leave a warm fire," Duke grumbled. "Shame to freeze to death out." "In these mountains," Jenkins retorted. "Come on." More shuffling, the creak of leather and wood, the thud of the door opening and closing. Then silence, broken only by the distant murmur of men's voices growing fainter, the crunch of snow receding. Into the distance, Sarah remained motionless, afraid to trust the apparent departure. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Finally, certain they were truly gone, she pushed open the trapdoor and pulled herself painfully up into the cabin. The room was as they had left, its chairs askew, her half-formed corn cake scattered, Thomas's few possessions disturbed but not destroyed. Most alarmingly, the fire had been carelessly built up too high, flames licking dangerously close to the dry logs of the cabin wall. Sarah hurried to reduce the blaze, scraping burning logs away from the cabin wall and spreading them safely in the stone hearth. Only when the fire was under control did she allow herself to collapse in a chair, trembling with delayed fear and relief. She had barely begun to collect herself when the door burst open. Sarah screamed, scrambling backward, but it was Thomas, who stood in the doorway, bow in hand, eyes wild with concern. "Sarah?" He crossed the room in 2 strides, crouching before her chair, hands hovering near her shoulders, as if afraid to touch her. "Are you hurt?" "I saw the tracks. 3 men." "I'm all right," she managed, her voice shaking. "They didn't find me. I hid in the root cellar." Relief washed over his features, followed immediately by anger. "Who were they?" "Bounty hunters," Sarah replied. "Looking for Cherokee to take back for reward money. They mentioned a list of names. They searched for papers, anything with a name." Thomas's expression darkened. He rose and moved around the cabin, taking inventory of what had been disturbed. "Did they say where they were headed?" "Wilson's Creek," Sarah said. "They hope to reach it by nightfall." Thomas nodded grimly. "That would take them past 2 Feathers' place. He has young children." He began gathering supplies with quick, efficient movements. Extra arrows, a knife, dried meat. "You're going after them?" Sarah asked, alarmed. "To warn 2 Feathers," Thomas clarified, "not to fight." "But if they see you?" "They won't," he said with quiet confidence. "I know these woods better than any bounty hunter." Sarah watched him prepare, a cold knot of fear forming in her stomach. "When will you return?" Thomas paused, looking at her directly. "Before dawn. 2 Feathers lives 3 hours from here on foot. Less if I push." He hesitated, then added, "You should bar the door behind me. Use the root cellar again if anyone comes." Sarah nodded, rising unsteadily to her feet. "Be careful," she said softly. Something flickered in Thomas's eyes, surprise, perhaps, at her concern. He stepped closer, one hand rising to touch her cheek briefly, the gesture so unexpected that Sarah's breath caught. "I will return," he promised, his voice low and certain. Then he was gone, slipping out into the fading afternoon light like a shadow. Sarah barred the door as instructed, then set about restoring order to the cabin. As she worked, rearranging chairs, salvaging what she could of the cornmeal, returning books to their shelf, her thoughts circled endlessly around Thomas, moving through the winter forest, tracking men who would gladly collect a bounty on his head. Would he truly return by dawn? And if he didn't, what then? She was stronger than she had been 4 days ago, but still weak, still injured. The thought of facing the wilderness alone again, with no destination and winter in full force, filled her with dread. More than that, she realized with a jolt of surprise, she didn't want to leave this place, this unexpected haven. Didn't want to leave Thomas with his quiet strength and unexpected depth. The realization unsettled her. She had known this man less than a week. He was a stranger from a different world, with a history she knew almost nothing about. And yet, watching him disappear into the forest had felt like watching a piece of herself walk away. Sarah sank into a chair by the fire, one hand resting on her rounded belly. The child within stirred, a reassuring flutter of movement. "We'll be all right," she whispered, trying to convince herself as much as the unborn child. "He'll come back." Night descended swiftly over the mountains, bringing with it a bone-deep cold that seeped through the cabin walls, despite the fire's warmth. Sarah added logs carefully, mindful of the dwindling supply. Outside, the wind picked up again, whistling through the pine branches and rattling the shutters. Sleep proved elusive. Every creak of the settling cabin, every gust of wind had her sitting upright, straining to hear footsteps in the snow. Would it be Thomas returning safely, or the bounty hunters having discovered his pursuit? To distract herself, she returned to Thomas's books. The medical text particularly caught her interest, a comprehensive guide to plants of the Appalachian region, with detailed illustrations and notes on their uses. Many of the remedies matched what her grandmother had taught her, though the terminology differed. As she turned the pages, a folded piece of paper slipped out from between the leaves. Sarah hesitated, her conscience warring with curiosity. Finally, she unfolded it, revealing a letter written in an elegant hand. "Thomas, I hope this reaches you. The army moves us west tomorrow. They say Oklahoma Territory has good land, but it is not our land. Many are sick already. I fear the journey. I keep your promise close. When you are ready to join us, follow the setting sun past the great river. Ask for Yellowbird's people. The children speak of you often. Elizabeth has learned all her letters now and reads to the younger. And she has your stubborn spirit. May the ancestors watch over you, brother. Morning Dove." Sarah carefully refolded the letter, her heart aching with fresh understanding. Elizabeth, the name in the primer, was his niece, not his daughter. And Thomas had chosen to remain behind when his people were forced west, for reasons she could only guess at. She returned the letter to its hiding place, feeling both guilty for the intrusion and somehow closer to the enigmatic man who had saved her life. Everyone had secrets, histories carried like stones in their pockets. She was no different, with her own burdens of grief and rejection. The fire had burned low when a soft scraping at the door jolted Sarah from her uneasy doze. She scrambled for the knife Thomas had left her, heart pounding. Sarah. Thomas's voice, low and urgent. Open the door. Relief flooded through her as she hurried to lift the bar. Thomas stumbled in, snow-covered and exhausted, but mercifully whole. Behind him came another man, taller, older, with silver. Streaking his black hair, and two young children clutched to his chest, bundled in furs. "Two feathers," Thomas explained briefly, securing the door behind them. "And his daughters. The hunters found their cabin." The older man nodded gravely to Sarah, then carefully set down his precious burdens. The children, girls no more than 5 and 7, blinked owlishly in the firelight, clearly exhausted and frightened. "The fire," Thomas instructed already, moving to build it up. They walked far in the cold. Sarah hurried to help, bringing blankets for the newcomers, setting water to boil for tea. The older girl watched her warily, pressing close to her father's side, but the younger one stared with unabashed curiosity at Sarah's swollen belly. "Baby?" she asked, pointing. Sarah nodded, smiling despite the tension. "Yes, a baby. Not yet ready to meet the world." Two Feathers spoke softly to his daughter in Cherokee, then turned to Sarah. "Forgive Willow," he said in careful English. "She has not seen many white women." "There's nothing to forgive," Sarah assured him. "She's lovely." As Thomas and Two Feathers conferred in low voices near the door, Sarah coaxed the children to sit near the fire, wrapping them in blankets and offering cups of sweet tea. The older girl, whose name she learned was Cedar, remained solemn and watchful, but little Willow soon dozed against Sarah's arm, exhaustion overcoming caution. "They burned the cabin," Thomas finally explained, joining Sarah by the fire. Two Feathers saw the smoke from the hunting trail, kept the children in the forest. "Oh, they took Mama's things," Cedar said suddenly, her small voice tight with anger. "Her loom, her baskets." Two Feathers crossed to his daughter, placing a gentle hand on her head. "Things can be remade, little Cedar. People cannot." The simple wisdom of this seemed to steady the child, though her eyes remained shadowed with a grief too deep for her years. Sarah wondered what had happened to the girl's mother, but knew better than to ask. "You'll stay here tonight," Thomas told Two Feathers. "Tomorrow we'll decide what's safest." The older man nodded his thanks. "The hunters spoke of returning to Pinewood with their prizes," he said. "They took what they could carry from my home." Sarah stiffened at the mention of Pinewood. "When?" she asked, a new fear taking root. "2 days, they said," Two Feathers replied. "They have business there first." Thomas caught her expression. "What is it?" "William Harmon," Sarah said. Quietly. "The man who led the council against me. He has connections in Asheville, trading partnerships. What if these are his men?" Thomas's brow furrowed. "Would he send hunters after you?" "I don't know," Sarah admitted. "But he wanted me dead, not just gone. Said I deserved the rope for bringing sickness to the children." Two Feathers and Thomas exchanged a meaningful glance. "If they return to Pinewood," Two Feathers said slowly, "and speak of finding a white woman with a Cherokee." "They'll come looking," Thomas finished grimly. The cabin suddenly felt smaller, the walls less secure. Sarah's hand moved protectively to her belly. Just when she had begun to feel safe, to believe she might survive the winter, the world had tilted again. "We should move tonight," Two Feathers suggested. "My sister's place near the Tennessee line." "No," Thomas interrupted, shaking his head. "Too dangerous in darkness with the children, and Sarah cannot travel far yet." He glanced toward her injured ankle. "We rest tonight. Plan tomorrow." No one argued. The gravity of the situation had settled over the cabin like a shroud. By unspoken agreement, they prepared for sleep. Two Feathers and his daughters taking furs near the fire, Thomas insisting Sarah keep the bed. "You need rest most," he told her quietly when she protested. "For the child." She couldn't argue. With that, though guilt nagged at her for displacing him from his own bed. As she settled beneath the warm furs, Sarah watched Thomas check the windows, the door, his weapons. His movements were precise, controlled, but she could sense the tension coiled within him. When he finally settled on a pallet near the door, rifle close at hand, Sarah whispered, "I'm sorry to bring this trouble to you." Thomas turned toward her voice in the darkness. "You did not bring it," he replied simply. "It was already here. Sleep now." Despite his reassurance, Sarah's dreams were troubled. Visions of fire and pursuit, of William Harmon's face twisted with hatred, of her students turning away from her in fear. She woke frequently, gasping and disoriented, each time finding comfort in the steady breathing of the others in the darkened cabin. Dawn broke clear and pitilessly cold, sunlight glinting off the snow with blinding brilliance. Thomas was already up, conferring with Two Feathers at the table, maps spread. Between them, the children still slept, Cedar's arm protectively around her little sister. Sarah eased herself out of bed, testing her ankle. The swelling had receded further, and though it still ached, she could put more weight on it than before. She joined the men at the table, accepting a cup of coffee from Thomas with grateful hands. "The hunters will return to Pinewood," Two Feathers was saying, tracing a route on the crude map. "If they speak of seeing smoke from your cabin, others will come to investigate." "Nah? How many days do we have?" Sarah asked. Thomas glanced at her. 2, perhaps 3 before they reach Pinewood. Another day for them to organize a search party. "Where can we go that's safe?" she pressed. "For all of us." The men exchanged looks. "West is safest," Two Feathers said finally. "Beyond the mountains. My sister's people have a settlement there, hidden in a valley the white authorities rarely visit. It's a difficult journey in winter," Thomas added, "especially for..." His eyes dropped briefly to Sarah's rounded belly. "I can travel," she insisted. "I'm stronger than I look." A ghost of a smile touched Thomas's lips. "I know that," he said quietly, "but the journey would take at least a week through high passes likely blocked with snow. And my daughters are young for such a crossing," Two Feathers added. "We need shelter closer, at least until spring makes the western trail passable." Thomas nodded, turning back to the map. "Here," he said, indicating a spot near a river bend. "My uncle's old hunting cabin. It's well hidden, on Cherokee land that the settlement maps don't show. They wouldn't think to look there." "Is it sound?" Two Feathers asked. "Last I saw it, yes. 2 days' journey for us, less if we had horses." "The bounty hunters took mine," Two Feathers said grimly, "and mine are not strong enough to carry. All of us in deep snow," Thomas admitted. "We'll have to walk, carry what we can." Sarah's mind raced. She thought of the desperate flight from Pinewood, how close she had come to death before Thomas found her. Could she truly make another journey through the winter wilderness? And yet, what choice did they have? "When do we leave?" she asked. Thomas met her gaze steadily. "Today, as soon as we can prepare." The next hours passed in a flurry of activity. Thomas and Two Feathers butchered a deer Thomas had killed the previous day, smoking as much meat as they could in the limited time. Sarah worked with Cedar to pack provisions, cornmeal, dried beans, herbs wrapped carefully in cloth. Little Willow followed Sarah everywhere, fascinated by her pregnancy, offering childish help that often created more work, but brought welcome, moments of lightness to the grim preparations. She showed Sarah a doll made from corn husks, explaining in a mixture of English and Cherokee that the doll would keep baby safe on the long walk. Sarah accepted the gift with genuine gratitude, tucking it into the pocket of the buckskin dress that had once belonged to Thomas's sister. The simple kindness from this child, who had lost so much, brought tears to her eyes. By mid-morning they were ready. Thomas had fashioned a better crutch for Sarah, reinforced with deer sinew and padded with rabbit fur. 2 small sledges would carry their provisions, to be pulled by Thomas and 2 feathers. The children would walk when they could, be carried when they couldn't. "Stay close," Thomas instructed as they prepared to leave the cabin. "Follow our tracks exactly. If you hear or see anything strange, freeze, don't run." Sarah nodded, adjusting, her shawl around her shoulders. Fear knotted in her stomach, but she forced it down. She had survived worse, would survive this. They left the cabin as they had found it. Fire banked safely, door secured. Thomas took one last look around the small space that had been his home for 5 years, his expression unreadable. Then he shouldered his pack, nodded once, and led them out into the blinding white world. The journey was grueling from the first hour. The snow reached past Sarah's knees in places, making each step an exercise in determination. She leaned heavily on the crutch, gritting her teeth against the pain that shot through her injured ankle with every movement. Thomas broke trail, his powerful frame forging a path through the drifts. 2 feathers followed with the children, little Willow riding on his shoulders when the snow grew too deep, Cedar struggling bravely beside him. Sarah came next. Then Thomas circled back periodically to check on her progress, his face tight with concern. "We can rest," he suggested after she stumbled for the 3rd time in as many minutes. Sarah shook her head, panting slightly. "I'm fine. Keep going." Thomas studied her for a moment, then unexpectedly smiled, a rare, full smile that transformed his serious face. "You are stubborn," he observed, "like the mountain oak that bends but does not break in the storm." The compliment warmed her, more than any fire could have. She squared her shoulders and pressed forward, following his trail through the endless white. They stopped at midday, in the shelter of a rock outcropping, sharing dried venison and sips of water from a skin 2 feathers carried. The children huddled against their father, faces pinched with cold despite their fur wrappings. "How much further?" "Today?" Sarah asked, massaging her aching leg. 3 more hours, maybe 4, Thomas replied, scanning the sky. "There's another storm coming. We need to reach Hell Creek before it hits." "Hell Creek?" Sarah repeated, startled by the ominous name. Thomas's mouth quirked. "White trappers named it. The Cherokee call it Singing Waters. There's a hunter's shelter there. Not much, but it will keep the snow off for the night." As they prepared to move on, Sarah caught Thomas watching her with concern. "What is it?" she asked quietly, when 2 feathers had moved ahead with the children. "The child," he said, nodding toward her belly. "This journey. It could come too soon." Fear flickered through her at the thought. "What choice do I have?" "None," he admitted. "But I worry." The simple admission, "I worry," touched her deeply. How long had it been since anyone had worried for her, had seen her as something precious to be protected? "I'm stronger than I look," she reminded him, touching his arm briefly. "We both are." The journey resumed, somehow harder after the brief rest had allowed muscles to stiffen. The terrain grew more challenging as they descended toward the creek. The slope, treacherous with hidden ice beneath the snow. Cedar fell once, sliding several yards before 2 feathers caught her. The child didn't cry, though blood stained the snow where she had scraped her palms. She merely set her small jaw and continued forward, refusing her father's offer to carry her. Sarah recognized the determined tilt of the girl's chin, the pride that wouldn't allow her to be a burden. How many children had she taught who wore that same expression? Children who came to school hungry but never complained, who walked miles in worn shoes but never asked for pity. As the afternoon waned, the promised storm began to gather. Clouds built in towering columns to the northwest, their underbellies dark with impending snow. The wind picked up, driving icy particles against their faces like tiny needles. "There," Thomas called above the rising wind, pointing toward a line of evergreens ahead. The creek runs beyond those trees. The shelter is just past it. The knowledge that safety waited ahead lent Sarah fresh strength. She pushed forward, ignoring the fire in her ankle, the ache in her back, the weight of the child pressing down with each step. They reached the tree line just as the first heavy snowflakes began to fall. The wind had risen to a mournful howl, bending the pine boughs and sending snow devils dancing across the open ground behind them. The creek itself was mostly frozen, a ribbon of black water visible only in the center where the current ran too swift to freeze. Thomas led them to a fallen log that bridged the narrow stream, testing it carefully before allowing the others to cross. Sarah eyed the makeshift bridge with trepidation. The log wasn't wide, and a thin crust of ice made it treacherously slick. With her injured ankle and ungainly balance, it might as well have been a tightrope. "I'll carry you," Thomas said, reading her hesitation. She started to protest, but he shook his head firmly. "The child," he reminded her. "If you fall." He didn't need to finish the thought. Sarah nodded, allowing him to lift her into his arms. As he had on that first night, Thomas carried her with surprising gentleness, his steps careful but confident as he crossed the log. On the far bank, he set her down with reluctance, his hands lingering briefly at her waist to ensure she was steady. "Not far now," he promised. The shelter, when they reached it, proved to be little more than a three-sided lean-to built against a rocky hillside, but after hours in the open, it seemed a palace. A crude fire pit occupied the center, surrounded by stones blackened from previous fires. Two Feathers immediately set about gathering what dry wood could be found beneath the sheltering pines, while Thomas cleared snow from the shelter's floor. The children, exhausted from the journey, sat huddled together watching with heavy-lidded eyes. Sarah busied herself unpacking provisions, setting water to boil in a small pot Thomas had carried. The simple tasks grounded her, kept the fear at bay. One moment at a time, one step after another. That was how survival worked. As darkness fell fully, they huddled around a small fire, the open side of the shelter now partially blocked with pine boughs to keep out the worst of the wind and snow. They ate sparingly, smoked venison and a thin porridge made from cornmeal, aware that their supplies needed to last. "How much further to your uncle's cabin?" Sarah asked, watching snowflakes dance in the firelight where they drifted through, gaps in their windbreak. "Another full day if the weather holds," Thomas replied. "Longer if the storm worsens." Two Feathers nodded grimly. "The signs are not good. This storm has teeth." As if in agreement, the wind rose to a shriek, sending a shower of snow cascading through their makeshift barrier. Little Willow whimpered, pressing closer to her father. "Tell us a story, teacher," Cedar said suddenly, looking at Sarah with those solemn eyes too old for her young face. "A story to make the storm go away." Sarah smiled at the child, touched by her use of the title teacher. "Stories can't make storms go away," she said gently, "but they can help us forget about them for a while." She settled more comfortably against her pack, considering what tale might best distract from their precarious situation. Not something frightening, certainly. Perhaps. "Did you ever hear about the girl with the red cape who outsmarted the wolf?" she began, watching Cedar's eyes widen with interest. As Sarah wove the familiar fairy tale, embellishing where she thought it would please her small audience, she became aware that Thomas and Two Feathers were listening just as intently as the children. When she described Little Red Riding Hood, noticing the wolf's large eyes and teeth, Two Feathers chuckled, a rich sound that seemed to warm the shelter more than the fire. "Smart girl," he commented. "Always look at the teeth first." The children giggled, and even Thomas's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. For a moment, the howling storm seemed distant, unimportant. When Sarah finished the tale, Cedar immediately asked for another. "Something with snow," she requested. "But a happy snow, not a scary one." Sarah thought for a moment, then began the story of the Snow Queen, carefully modifying the darker elements for her young listeners. As she spoke, she noticed Thomas watching her, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. Something in his gaze made her voice falter briefly, a warmth, an appreciation that went beyond simple enjoyment of the story. The tales continued until both children had fallen asleep. Cedar's head pillowed on her father's lap, Willow curled like a kitten between them. Two Feathers nodded his thanks to Sarah as he gently arranged blankets over his daughters. "You have a gift," he said quietly. "The words come alive when you speak them." "I've had practice," Sarah replied, "reading to children who didn't always want to sit still for lessons." "It is more than practice," Two Feathers disagreed. "It is a heart that understands what stories mean." He glanced toward Thomas. "Like my friend here with his books of poetry." Thomas looked almost embarrassed, busying himself with adding wood to the fire. "We should sleep," he said. "Tomorrow will be difficult." They arranged themselves as comfortably as possible in the small shelter, the children in the most protected corner, Two Feathers beside them. Thomas insisted Sarah take the space closest to the fire, while he positioned himself near the entrance, rifle close at hand. Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded Sarah. Her body ached from the day's journey, and the child within her seemed unusually active, turning and kicking as if protesting the cold and discomfort. Outside, the storm continued unabated. Snow now, falling so thickly that it created a white curtain across the shelter's open side. After what seemed hours of restless shifting, Sarah heard Thomas's voice low in the darkness. "You should sleep." "I'm trying," she whispered back. "The baby is restless tonight." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then, to her surprise, he moved. Closer, settling beside her near the fire. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward her belly. Startled but curious, Sarah nodded. Thomas placed his large hand gently on the curve of her stomach, his palm warm even through the layers of clothing. The baby kicked immediately, as if responding to the touch. Thomas smiled, a flash of white teeth in the firelight. "Strong," he observed, "already fighting." "Like their mother?" Sarah suggested, remembering his earlier words. "Exactly like their mother," he agreed, his voice carrying a warmth that seemed to flow through his hand into her tired body. They sat in companionable silence, Thomas's hand remaining on her belly, the baby gradually calming beneath his touch. Sarah felt her eyelids growing heavy, the day's tensions slowly unraveling. "My wife," Thomas said suddenly, so softly she almost didn't hear him. "She lost 2 babies before the one that took her life, both in winter, both during hard times." Sarah's heart ached at the simple tragedy of those words. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Thomas nodded, his face half in shadow. "The Cherokee say that some souls are too impatient for this world. They come when the mother is not ready, or they leave before their time." "And some stay," Sarah murmured, thinking of the persistent life inside her that had clung on through exposure, starvation, and fear. "Yes," Thomas agreed, "some stay." His hand still rested on her belly, a warm weight that somehow made the howling storm seem less threatening. "Sleep now," he said. "I will watch." Oddly comforted by his presence, Sarah finally drifted into sleep, dreaming of a cabin in summer, sunlight streaming through windows, the sound of a child's laughter mingling with deeper voices outside. She woke briefly sometime in the night to find Thomas still beside her, his back against a pine log, his eyes open and watchful in the dying firelight. He had spread his own blanket over her while she slept. "The storm?" she asked drowsily. "Still strong," he replied. "But we are safe enough here." Sarah nodded, already slipping back toward sleep. Just before consciousness faded, she felt Thomas's hand gently brush a strand of hair from her face. "Rest," he whispered. "I am here." Morning brought an altered world. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind drifts taller than a man in places. The shelter itself was half buried, snow having built up against the pine bough barrier to create a surprisingly effective insulation. Sarah woke to find the children already up, Cedar helping her father prepare a meager breakfast, while Willow attempted to fashion a doll from pine cones and twigs. Thomas was absent, presumably scouting their route for the day ahead. "Good morning, teacher," Cedar greeted her solemnly. "Did you sleep well?" "Better than I expected," Sarah replied truthfully, struggling to sit up with her awkward belly. "Thank you for asking." Two Feathers handed her a cup of hot tea, pine needle brew from the smell of it, rich in vital nutrients her grandmother had sworn would ward off winter ailments. "The snow is deep," he informed her, his expression grave. "Thomas has gone to find the best path." As if summoned by his name, Thomas appeared at the shelter's entrance, snow crusting his leggings and dusting his dark hair. His expression told Sarah everything she needed to know before he spoke. "The way ahead is blocked," he announced without preamble. "An avalanche came down from the high ridge during the night. The path to my uncle's cabin is buried." Two Feathers absorbed this news with stoic calm. "Another route?" Thomas shook his head. "Not one we could take with children and—" He glanced at Sarah. "Not one safe for all of us." "So we're trapped," Sarah said, voicing what no one else would. "Not trapped," Thomas corrected, "but we cannot go forward as planned." "What then?" Two Feathers asked, his arms automatically encircling his daughters as they pressed against him, sensing the adult's concern. Thomas crouched by the fire, warming his hands. "We have two choices," he said after a moment's thought. "Return to my cabin and hope the hunters do not come back. Or—" he hesitated, looking at Sarah. "Or—" she prompted. "Or we go south," he said reluctantly. "There is a settlement there, mostly white trappers and traders, but some Cherokee, people who live apart from towns like Pinewood. Would they welcome us?" Two Feathers asked skeptically. "Some would, some wouldn't." Thomas's gaze remained on Sarah. "It would be dangerous, especially for you. If anyone from Pinewood trades there—" "They might recognize me," Sarah finished. "Report back that the witch still lives," Thomas nodded grimly. "But they have a doctor, a real one, trained in Philadelphia, and shelter sturdy enough for tea." His eyes dropped to her swollen belly. The implication was clear. While Thomas had delivered her child in an emergency, proper medical care would significantly improve her chances if complications arose. And winter in the mountains was no place for a newborn without solid shelter. "How far to this settlement?" Sarah asked, mind racing. 2 days normally, 3 with the snow this deep. She considered their options, one hand absently stroking her belly where the child shifted restlessly. Return to a cabin that hunters knew about, or press on to an uncertain welcome among strangers who might harbor those who wished her harm. Neither choice promised safety, but one offered at least the possibility of proper care when her time came. "We go south," she decided firmly, "to the settlement." Thomas held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded once. "We leave as soon as you've eaten. The day is already half gone." As they packed up their meager possessions, Sarah caught Two Feathers watching her with an odd expression, not disapproval exactly, but something close to it. "You disagree with my choice," she said quietly, when Thomas had taken the children outside to show them how to fashion snowshoes from pine boughs. Two Feathers considered her thoughtfully. "It is not my place to agree or disagree," he replied. "But I wonder if you understand what you risk." "My life," Sarah said simply. "The baby's life, I know." "More than that," Two Feathers corrected. You risk his. He nodded toward where Thomas could be seen instructing the children, his hands gentle as he helped little Willow secure her makeshift snowshoes. Sarah frowned, not understanding. Thomas, how? A Cherokee man bringing a pregnant white woman into a settlement, even one as inflexible as Crossroads, Two Feathers explained. It will raise questions, dangerous ones. The implication struck Sarah with sudden clarity. In the eyes of most white settlements, a Cherokee man traveling with a white woman, especially one in her condition, would be seen as having abducted her or worse. I'll explain, she said. Tell them the truth, that he saved my life. Two Feathers smiled sadly. Truth is a luxury, teacher, one rarely afforded to my people when white justice is concerned. His words settled heavily on Sarah's heart. She had been thinking only of immediate survival, shelter, warmth, a safe place to birth her child. But what good was her survival if it came at the cost of Thomas's freedom or life? What would you suggest? She asked, genuinely seeking his counsel. Two Feathers considered for a moment. If we go to Crossroads, you must have a story ready, one that protects him, and you must be the one to speak it first, before questions can be asked. What kind of story? Your husband, Two Feathers said simply, killed by the fever that struck Pinewood. Thomas, a guide hired to take you to family in Tennessee. Me and my daughters, travelers you met on the road. The fabrication was simple, plausible. It would explain her condition, their unlikely grouping, their presence in the mountains during winter. Thomas would be just a hired guide, Sarah repeated slowly, testing the words. Why did they taste so false on her tongue? For his safety, Two Feathers reminded her. And yours, Sarah nodded, understanding the necessity but hating the deception. After Pinewood had turned on her with false accusations, the idea of entering another settlement with lies, however protective, felt like carrying a poisonous snake next to her heart. But Two Feathers was right. Truth was indeed a luxury, one she couldn't afford if she wanted to protect Thomas, as he had protected her. I'll do it, she agreed finally, but I don't like it. Two Feathers' weathered face creased in a brief smile. Liking and living are not always the same path, he observed. Come, the others are waiting. As they emerged from the shelter, into the blinding whiteness of the snow-covered landscape, Sarah caught Thomas's eye. He nodded once, a gesture of encouragement or perhaps approval of her decision. She hoped desperately that she wasn't leading him into danger greater than what they'd fled. The journey south began in earnest, their small party making slow but steady progress through the transformed wilderness. The snowshoes Thomas had fashioned made travel possible, distributing their weight across the deep snow rather than forcing them to plow through it. Even so, the going was grueling. Sarah's injured ankle protested every step, and the weight of her pregnancy seemed to increase hourly. The baby had settled lower in her belly, creating new pressure that occasionally took her breath away. Thomas noticed her discomfort, circling back frequently to walk beside her, offering silent support. When a particularly sharp pain made her pause, gasping, he was there immediately, his arms strong around her waist. The child moves down, he observed, concern evident in his voice. Preparing. Sarah nodded, unable to speak until the discomfort passed. It's too soon, she finally managed. 2 months at least. Thomas's expression grew grave. We must reach Crossroads before nightfall tomorrow, he said decisively. You need real shelter, a proper bed. When she could walk again, he stayed close, occasionally taking some of her weight when the terrain grew especially challenging. Their progress slowed, Two Feathers and the children often waiting for them to catch up at the crest of each small ridge. I'm slowing everyone down, Sarah said in frustration after a particularly difficult ascent. You should go ahead with Two Feathers. Send help back. No, Thomas replied firmly. "We stay together." The vehemence in his voice surprised her. Thomas was not a man given to emotional displays, yet there was something almost fierce in his refusal to leave her behind. By late afternoon, the sun was already slipping toward the horizon, the short winter day nearly gone. They had covered perhaps half the distance Thomas had hoped for, their pace dictated by Sarah's increasingly labored steps and the children's flagging energy. "We need shelter for the night," Two Feathers announced, surveying the darkening sky. "The little ones cannot go further today." Thomas nodded in agreement, his eyes scanning the rugged landscape. "There's a hunting camp 2 miles ahead," he said, "used by Cherokee in summer. It should have a fire pit at least, maybe walls still standing." Sarah bit her lip, determined not to be the one to suggest stopping sooner. The nagging discomfort in her lower back had intensified throughout the afternoon, occasionally sharpening into pains that wrapped around her abdomen like iron bands. They pressed on as twilight deepened around them, the forest growing ominous with lengthening shadows. Cedar carried her sister now, the younger child having reached the limit of her endurance hours earlier. Two Feathers pulled both sledges, his face set in lines of grim determination. When they finally reached the hunting camp, it proved to be little more than a circular clearing with a stone fire pit at its center and the remnants of a lean-to against a rocky outcropping. But after the day's exhausting journey, it seemed a haven. Thomas immediately set about improving the shelter, reinforcing the leaning poles with fresh branches, while Two Feathers gathered wood for a fire. The children huddled together near the fire pit, too tired even to complain of hunger or cold. Sarah tried to help, but another wave of pain, stronger than before, doubled her over. She clutched at a tree trunk, a small sound escaping her despite her efforts to remain silent. Thomas was at her side in an instant, his face taut with concern. "How long?" he asked quietly. "Since morning," she admitted. "But it's just the walking. Too much exertion." He studied her face, clearly unconvinced. "Two Feathers," he called, his eyes not leaving her face. "Make the fire high and heat water." The older man glanced up from his task, understanding immediately. With a brief nod, he set to work building the fire higher, sending Cedar to gather snow in the cooking pot. "It's too early," Sarah whispered, fear finally breaking through her determined facade. "Thomas, it's too soon." "Babies come when they will," he replied, helping her toward the makeshift shelter. "Not when we wish them to." He settled her on a bed of pine boughs hastily arranged beneath the lean-to, then knelt beside her, his face etched with concern. "I have delivered babies before," he reminded her, "but not early ones." Another contraction seized her, stronger than the last. Sarah gripped Thomas's hand, breathing through the pain, as her grandmother had taught her to do during the births she'd attended in Pinewood. "The baby will be small," she gasped when the pain subsided. "Fragile. It will need warmth. Constant warmth." Thomas nodded grimly. "We will do what we can." As the night deepened around them, Sarah's labor intensified. The contractions came closer together, each one stealing her breath and strength. Thomas remained by her side, wiping her brow with snow-dampened cloth, supporting her back when the pain drove her upright. Two Feathers kept the fire blazing, occasionally bringing fresh tea brewed from herbs in Thomas's pack. The children huddled together at the edge of the clearing, Cedar whispering reassurances to her frightened little sister. "Tell me a story," Sarah pleaded between contractions, desperate for distraction from the mounting pain and fear. "Anything." Thomas hesitated, his usual reticence warring with her need. Then, in a low voice meant only for her ears, he began to speak of his childhood. Growing up near Butler Creek, learning to hunt from his father, gathering herbs with his grandmother. He spoke of swimming in summer-warm rivers, of community dances where he'd first seen his future wife, of the birth of his nephew that had filled his sister with such joy. His words created a bridge between their separate worlds, a shared vision of what family and belonging could mean. Even as her body labored to bring new life into the world, Sarah found herself transported by his quiet voice, glimpsing the rich tapestry of experiences that had shaped this complex, gentle man. When a particularly vicious contraction cut through his words, Thomas gripped her hand firmly. "You are stronger than this pain," he told her, his dark eyes intense in the firelight. "Stronger than the mountain oak, remember?" Sarah nodded, clinging to his certainty when her own faltered. As midnight approached, her waters finally broke, soaking the blankets beneath her. The labor shifted then, becoming more urgent, more purposeful. "It comes soon," Two Feathers observed, bringing more heated water. "The child is impatient to meet its mother." Thomas positioned himself to assist with the birth, his hands steady despite the gravity of the situation. "When the next pain comes," he instructed Sarah, "push with it, not against it." She nodded, gathering her remaining strength. The next contraction built like a wave, cresting with an intensity that tore a cry from her throat. She bore down with all her might, feeling the child shift within her. "Good," Thomas encouraged. Again with the next one. 3 more contractions, 3 more desperate pushes. Sarah's world narrowed to this primal struggle, this battle to bring life from her body despite cold and fear and impossible circumstances. "I see the head," Thomas announced, his voice tight with concentration. "Dark hair. 1 more push, Sarah." Summoning strength she didn't know she possessed, Sarah gave a final mighty push. There was a moment of searing pressure, then sudden release as the baby slipped into Thomas's waiting hands. For one terrible moment, silence hung in the clearing. Then a thin, indignant cry split the night, the sound of new life announcing itself to the world with surprising vigor. "A girl," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. "Small, but strong." He quickly wrapped the infant in clean cloths, warmed by the fire, then placed the tiny bundle on Sarah's chest. Sarah gazed down at her daughter through tears of exhaustion and wonder. Despite her early arrival, the baby seemed perfect. A tiny face screwed up in protest at the cold world, miniature fingers flexing against the swaddling. "Emma," Sarah whispered, the name she'd chosen months ago if the baby was a girl. "Emma Mitchell." Thomas smiled, a full, unguarded smile that transformed his face. "Welcome, Emma Mitchell," he said softly. "You have your mother's fighting spirit." Two Feathers approached, bearing tea for Sarah and fresh cloths. The children followed cautiously, their eyes wide with wonder at the sight of the newborn. "She's very small," Cedar observed, concern in her young voice. "But mighty," Two Feathers assured his daughter, "like the hummingbird that guards its nest against the hawk." As Thomas completed the necessary tasks following the birth, Sarah felt a strange peace descend despite their precarious situation. They were still in the wilderness, miles from proper shelter, with dangers on all sides. The baby had come too early, too small to face such harsh conditions, and yet, looking at the tiny life cradled against her, Sarah felt an impossible hope take root. They had made it this far against all odds. They would find a way forward. The remainder of the night passed in a blur of exhaustion and wonder. Thomas and Two Feathers took turns keeping the fire blazing, creating a pocket of warmth in the freezing wilderness. Little Emma nursed weakly but persistently, her tiny body seeming to gain strength with each passing hour. As dawn approached, Thomas knelt beside Sarah, his expression serious. "You cannot travel today," he said, "not after the birth, not with the child so small." "But the settlement," Sarah began. "I will go," he interrupted. "Alone, I can reach Crossroads by midday. Bring back help, a wagon, blankets." "No," Sarah protested, fear gripping her heart. Two Feathers' warning echoed in her mind. The danger Thomas might face entering a white settlement alone. "It's not safe for you." Thomas's expression softened. "It's less safe for you and Emma to remain in the open another night," he countered. "The child needs proper shelter, warmth." She knew he was right, but the thought of him facing potential danger alone was unbearable. "Promise me you'll be careful," she insisted, "that you'll return." "I promise," he said simply, his hand brushing her cheek with unexpected tenderness. Then, to her surprise, he bent and pressed a gentle kiss to Emma's downy head. "Keep her warm," he instructed. "Two Feathers will watch over you until I return." As the first pale light of dawn filtered through the pines, Thomas prepared for his journey. He took only what he needed: his knife, a water skin, a handful of jerky. Two Feathers helped him fashion better snowshoes from pine boughs, the two men conferring in low voices. "Remember our story?" Sarah called to him as he prepared to leave. "If anyone questions you, I am a guide," Thomas finished, understanding her meaning. "Taking a widow to her family in Tennessee." Their eyes met across the clearing, a world of unspoken feeling passing between them. Then Thomas nodded once, shouldered his meager provisions, and disappeared into the winter forest. The day crawled by with agonizing slowness. Sarah dozed fitfully, waking at every sound to check on Emma or scan the trees for Thomas's return. Two Feathers maintained the fire and kept watch, his rifle across his knees, while the children entertained themselves with quiet games. As afternoon faded toward evening, Sarah's anxiety mounted. Thomas should have reached Crossroads hours ago. Even allowing time to arrange transport, he should have been on his way back. "Something's wrong," she said to Two Feathers as the shadows lengthened. "He should be here by now." The older man's face remained impassive, but concern flickered in his eyes. "The journey is difficult," he reminded her, "and arranging help may take time." "Or something happened to him," Sarah voiced her deepest fear. "Someone recognized him or—" She broke off as a sound reached them, the distant jingle of harness bells. Two Feathers was on his feet instantly, rifle ready, positioning himself between the clearing and the approaching noise. "Stay back," he warned Sarah and the children, "until we know who comes." The sound grew louder, not just bells now, but the creak of wheels, the snort of horses, voices calling encouragement to the struggling team. Then, breaking through the trees at the edge of the clearing came a sight Sarah had scarcely dared hope for. A sturdy wagon pulled by two draft horses, with Thomas seated beside the driver. "Thomas!" Cedar cried, her young voice ringing with relief. Sarah clutched Emma closer, tears springing to her eyes as Thomas jumped down from the wagon and strode toward them, followed by a stout, bearded man in a heavy coat. "You're safe," she whispered as he reached her side, his eyes quickly assessing both her and the baby. "As promised," he replied, a smile tugging at his mouth, "and I brought help." The bearded man stepped forward, extending a hand to Sarah. "Dr. James Wilson," he introduced himself. "Thomas here tells me you've had quite an ordeal, Mrs. Mitchell." Sarah noted the use of her proper title with relief. Thomas had maintained their protective fiction. "Thank you for coming, Doctor," she replied. "My daughter arrived earlier than expected." The doctor knelt to examine the swaddled infant, his practiced hands gentle as he unwrapped Emma enough to check her breathing and color. "Small but fighting," he pronounced, echoing Thomas's earlier assessment. "She'll do better in proper shelter, though. We should move you both as soon as possible." Two Feathers had already begun gathering their meager possessions, directing Cedar to help her sister prepare for travel. The doctor returned to the wagon, arranging blankets to create a comfortable nest for Sarah and the baby. As Thomas helped her to her feet, Sarah whispered, "Did anyone question you? About me? About why you were there?" He shook his head slightly. "Dr. Wilson asked few questions," He is different from most white men I have known. Different how? Thomas considered this. He sees people first, not their skin or language, he finally replied. His wife is half Cherokee. That changes a man's view of the world. Relief flooded through Sarah. Perhaps Crossroads would indeed offer the sanctuary they needed, not just temporary shelter, but a place where they might exist without constant fear. With Thomas's support, she made her way to the wagon, each step a reminder of the ordeal her body had just endured. Emma fussed slightly at the movement, her tiny face scrunching in protest. "Hush, little one," Sarah soothed. "We're going somewhere, warm, somewhere safe." As Thomas lifted her carefully into the wagon, their eyes met again. In his gaze, Sarah saw not just concern for her welfare, but something deeper, something that made her heart beat faster despite her exhaustion. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." His hand lingered on hers. "We are not finished yet," he replied softly. "There is more road ahead." The journey to Crossroads took less than 2 hours, the sturdy wagon making better progress than they could have on foot. Dr. Wilson drove carefully, avoiding the worst drifts and jarring bumps, occasionally calling back to check on his passengers. Thomas rode alongside the wagon on a borrowed horse, his eyes constantly scanning the trail ahead and the forest around them. Two Feathers and the children rode in the wagon bed behind Sarah, providing extra warmth against the evening chill. As darkness fell, lights appeared ahead, the scattered glow of cabin windows, the brighter illumination of what must be the settlement's main buildings. Crossroads was smaller than Pinewood, Sarah noted with relief, less likely to harbor those who might recognize her. The wagon rolled into the settlement's central square, little more than a widening of the main trail with a few buildings clustered. Around it, a trading post, a smithy, a small church, and a 2-story structure with a sign identifying it as Wilson's boarding house and medical office. "My wife will have soup waiting," Dr. Wilson announced as he drew the wagon to a halt. "And a warm bed for you and the little one, Mrs. Mitchell." As promised, Mrs. Wilson, a handsome woman with clear Cherokee heritage in her features, met them at the door with warm welcome and no prying questions. She ushered Sarah and Emma into a small but comfortable bedroom, already warmed by a blazing fire and furnished with a proper bed, a cradle, and a rocking chair. "My grandmother's," she explained, seeing Sarah's gaze on the lovingly crafted cradle. "It has held many babies, both Cherokee and white. Yours is welcome to it for as long as you stay." The simple kindness brought fresh tears to Sarah's eyes. "Thank you," she managed, "for everything." "Rest now," Mrs. Wilson instructed. "I'll bring broth shortly. Your guide and his friends will be well looked after in the bunkhouse." When she had gone, Sarah settled in the rocking chair with Emma at her breast, gazing around the cozy room in wonder. After days of desperate flight and outdoor shelters, the simple comforts, a real bed, solid walls, a steady fire, seemed almost unbelievable. A soft knock at the door roused her from contemplation. "Come in," she called, expecting Mrs. Wilson with the promised broth. Instead, Thomas entered, ducking his head slightly beneath the doorframe. He had washed, she noticed, and changed into clean clothes, probably borrowed, as they seemed slightly too large for his frame. "Two Feathers and the children are settled," he reported. "The doctor has offered them shelter for as long as needed." "And you?" Sarah asked, the question that truly mattered. Thomas hesitated, then moved to stand beside the fire, his profile outlined in golden light. "Dr. Wilson has offered me work," he said. "There is need for someone who knows the mountains, who can guide and hunt." Hope fluttered in Sarah's chest. "You'll stay, then?" "If you wish it," he replied, turning to face her fully. "My cabin can be rebuilt elsewhere when the time is right." The meaning behind his words was clear. He wasn't just offering to remain. In Crossroads, He was offering to remain with her, with Emma, to build something new from the ashes of their separate losses. "I wish it," Sarah said softly, holding his gaze. "Very much." Thomas crossed to where she sat, kneeling beside the rocking chair. With infinite gentleness, he touched Emma's tiny hand, his broad finger engulfed by her miniature grip. "She is strong," he observed, wonder in his voice, "like her mother. And she will need a father," Sarah replied, "someone to teach her the ways of the forest and the stories of the mountains." Thomas looked up, his dark eyes filled with an emotion Sarah had seen growing since that first night in his cabin, a feeling neither of them had dared name until now. "I would be honored," he said simply, "to be that for her, and more for you, if you will have me." In answer, Sarah leaned forward, her free hand cradling his cheek as she pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle, tentative, a beginning, rather than a culmination, a promise of everything that might be possible in this unexpected sanctuary they had found. When they parted, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "We have lost much," he murmured, "both of us, but perhaps, together, we can build something new." Outside, snow began to fall again, soft flakes drifting past the window like gentle blessings. But inside, warmth bloomed, not just from the fire in the hearth, but from the knowledge that even in the harshest wilderness, with danger and prejudice on all sides, love could take root and flourish. In her arms, Emma sighed contentedly, secure in her mother's embrace. And in that moment, Sarah knew with bone-deep certainty that they had found their way home, not to a place, but to each other. Up next, you've got two more standout stories. Right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.